Where has the Spanish GP been all season? It was beautiful chaos around the Circuit of Barcelona as we closed out the triple header of European tracks, and let me tell you, this Grand Prix brought us a little bit of everything. From Nico Hülkenberg dragging that tractor of a Kick Sauber deep into the points for a top 5 finish, to Alonso scoring his first points of the season at his home GP, to Verstappen colliding with Leclerc, to Russell colliding with Verstappen, to Verstappen taking what looked like a page out of the NASCAR playbook and ramming into the side of Russell. We had a bit of everything during this Grand Prix, and we will be discussing it here on this episode of the Grid Buzz podcast. Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into my race review for the Spanish GP, and it was an action-packed one, which was great to see after a lackluster Monaco GP. You know, this string of European circuits is typically remembered as difficult to pass, maybe not the most exciting circuits on the calendar as a result. And while that did hold true for Monaco, that did not hold true for Imola, and that definitely did not hold true for the Spanish GP. I think that the Spanish GP was probably the best Grand Prix of the season so far. That's how highly I am rating this GP, and I can't wait to just dive into my review and a recap of some of the key events that occurred during the race. Kicking it off, we had a lot of action right from the start, with a bunch of overtakes and chaos heading into turn 1 on lap 1. Piastri got another blinding fast start. He has been a just start specialist, it seems, all season, oftentimes getting better starts than even Max Verstappen. We've talked about this on previous episodes. Normally, Max Verstappen is considered the kind of race start specialist, the safety car restart specialist. Piastri is maybe taking the crown here. Maybe not on the safety car restarts, although he did have a pretty good safety car restart at the end of this race, but definitely on the beginning of the race starts, Piastri has been blinding quick. And then Norris, on the flip side, has been doing more of what Norris does through last season. He even did it a little bit at Monaco, but got away with it. He is just, something's going on. He is not quick off the line. He's consistently slower on starts, consistently putting himself on the back foot. And the Spanish GP was no different here. So heading into turn 1, Piastri opened up a pretty sizable gap, but then Norris put himself on the back foot, putting himself under pressure from Max, who got a fairly decent start. Max was ultimately able to overtake Norris as a result, and this kind of battle did happen to bunch up the back of the pack a little bit. Hamilton was another one who did not get a very good start, actually, but because the pack got bunched up between Norris and Max kind of battling it out into turn 1, Hamilton was able to take advantage of this and close the gap that he had on his bad start and go around the outside of Russell. So that was a pretty good move. Unfortunate for Russell that he got caught up and kind of slowed down by the people in front, but good to see one of the Ferrari boys be able to capitalize on that situation. And then Lawson almost got taken out as well in turn 1, lap 1, as someone collided with the rear of his Racing Bull's car. Lawson seems to get into a lot of carnage and a lot of incidents. I don't know if he's just unlucky or if he kind of puts himself in the situations. I will say this one seemed a bit unlucky, but I do think he tends to put himself in bad situations, and he had a couple of moments here that could have panned out in this GP as bad situations as well, but did get away with it, fortunately. And then we had Alonso and Hadjar battling, which led to Hülkenberg being able to overtake Alonso on the outside during the first lap. And then we had Hamilton and Leclerc a couple laps in. Very interesting to kind of see this. The Ferrari boys both had good starts. They got ahead of Russell, and Leclerc just clearly had a lot more pace than Hamilton over the weekend. Obviously, with qualifying yesterday and Leclerc deciding only to do the first run to save an extra set of softs for the race, which did end up panning out at the end of the race, which we will get to. But the track definitely seemed to come in during the second run of Q3 And so it put Leclerc a little bit on the back foot from a qualifying perspective, but it was good to see that all of those positions were essentially made up in the first lap with Hamilton and Leclerc both overtaking Russell. And then it turned into the Hamilton v. Leclerc battle while Verstappen, Norris, and Piastri were starting to walk away out front a little bit. I think that Ferrari this race a little bit, and we'll get into some of the specifics around what happened with Ferrari during the Spanish GP, but this was the first of the events. I think at the end of the day, luckily they got away with it the way the race unfolded, but it could have been a lot more impactful if it wasn't for that full safety car at the end of the race. Leclerc clearly had more pace. Hamilton was clearly slowing him down, and I get it. Like, they've had a little bit of these back and forth. Sometimes they've had team orders. Usually when they've had team orders, they've been slow to call the team orders. But this was another instance of, you could just tell that Leclerc was faster, and they probably should have called team orders sooner to free him up. The part that I did find actually pretty interesting, though, in this is not only was Leclerc faster and they were a little bit slow on the team orders, but Hamilton was actually pulling defensive maneuvers to slow down Leclerc into turn one. And I thought, I don't know. I mean, they are drivers. They're supposed to go racing. I get it, but it was a bit of an interesting move, I think, from Hamilton, who has generally been pretty good of a teammate, I would say, throughout the season. I mean, you can look back a couple races ago when Hamilton actually got ahead of team orders and flagged Leclerc through because he had more pace. And well, I understand maybe not coming quickly over the radio with team orders in these situations. I do think it was an interesting one to see Hamilton go defensive against Leclerc. So not just not let him by, but to actually go defensive when it was pretty clear that he had the pace to run out front. They're not battling for, a driver's championship. Neither one of them are really in contention at this point. And so I thought that was maybe a little bit unnecessary, especially because allowing Leclerc to run in the free air could have potentially given him a shot at the podium. Now, he did podium anyway because of the safety car, but had that not happened, that probably wouldn't have played out that way. And so I did find that move a little bit interesting. Fast forwarding a little bit, we have Alonso on his home race. He started out, looked pretty good through the first couple laps, had some pace, aside from, that Hülkenberg around the outside incident. Although, I think that was more driven from the battle between him and Hadjar and, Hülkenberg being able to capitalize on it. But Alonso makes a mistake that you rarely see out of Alonso and the caliber of driver that he is, locking up and washing wide and going off track into the gravel, which really kind of affected his race. Luckily, he was saved a little bit later on with the safety car, but had that not come into play, that was a pretty critical error and not something that you typically see out of Alonso. And then moving forward into the battle with Verstappen and Norris. So Verstappen was, looked to be pretty quick, maybe could have taken the fight to Piastri in the first couple laps, was pulling out front of Norris, and then Norris gets the radio from his race engineer that the tires have been properly brought into temperature and that he can go push now. And that was a dangerous event in the race because all of a sudden Norris, you could tell, was holding back pace and really started to pick up and bring the fight on Verstappen. Whereas Verstappen, it looked like, had really pushed hard at the beginning of the race, not only to get past Norris, but to try to make a run on Piastri, and was quickly, going through his tires at that rate. Norris caught up to the back of Verstappen. You could tell that he clearly had more pace than Verstappen. And so while I do think it was a smart move at first, because typically you would see Verstappen fight this super hard, go super defensive, overcook his tires, the typical things that you see in the Norris versus Verstappen battles. And what I thought was originally a smart decision was, Verstappen just recognizing that Norris had the pace, he wasn't going to be able to hold him, and just letting him by and, saving the fight for another day. But then the weird switch up was he then went and pitted for new tires a lap later. So I actually find that move super confusing. Maybe the team made that decision retroactively. I'm not really sure. I didn't hear any radio messages on it, but this was very interesting because in the last few races of this season, you've seen him go super defensive, fight super hard, and then he'll stay out for a few laps on cooked tires and really just affect his race pace. In this scenario, he lets Norris right by, does the smart thing from a tire management perspective, and then just pits the next lap, which was super confusing because I was like, well, I mean, if you were just going to pit the next lap, then you might as well got defensive, tried to hold up Norris. So I'm assuming that he didn't know the team was going to pull him in. Otherwise, I find that move pretty strange from Verstappen, and I don't think it was the right move. But like I said, maybe this is a little bit of hindsight bias here. The early pit stop, though, did put Verstappen on a 3-stop strategy while everyone else was on a 2-stop. Some people were looking like maybe they were going to push for a 1, but that did not happen. I do like the switch up of Verstappen going to a 3-stop, especially when you could tell from so early on that the McLarens just had so much pace in their car that you had to try something else to be competitive. So I do like the switch to the 3-stop, which looked to be actually pretty competitive for Verstappen and Red Bull until it all kind of unwound at the end of the race, but we will get to that in a moment. And then another interesting Ferrari strategy decision, very confusing. I don't know if they made a mistake here. It almost seems like they might have, but hitting Hamilton early and saying it was to cover off the undercut. And then when Hamilton asked the question again, they said it was to cover off the probable undercut. I found that pretty interesting because Mercedes gave no inclination that they were going to pit early and do an undercut. And so I think Ferrari was obviously like forecasting this here, but they were clearly wrong. And it was, I don't know, I feel like I've said this a lot this season where I feel like Ferrari has been better with their strategy decisions this season, whereas in the past they've been known for their general mishaps and all the things that, Ferrari being Ferrari. I do feel like this is a race that there was some glimmers of them going back to their old self with some very questionable decisions, I think, in my mind. And this was definitely one of them. And then we move forward into Lawson and Albon and the fight that they had. So this was an interesting fight, and I feel like the first move, honestly, Lawson was enough alongside of Albon, and Albon kind of forced him off the track, and then Lawson, cut the track, went off the track to gain an advantage. But I do feel like he had the right to be there, and Albon probably forced him off. And I don't know that Lawson actually had to give that position back. Now, obviously, the Racing Bulls team reviewed it and decided that they didn't really want to take the risk there, and they gave the position back, which is all good. And then Lawson, the next lap, basically did the exact same thing, overtook Albon again, and then Albon ended up hitting him, taking out his front wing and kind of sacrificing his race, ending up with a DNF, pulling into the pits just to find out that he had a 10-second penalty for causing a collision, and then having to go back out and serve that 10-second penalty before retiring the car. Was a bit of an interesting one from Albon because Albon seemed to think that Lawson was in the wrong here. I think in both situations, typically Lawson, let's be fair, is in the wrong on a lot of these. He tends to put his nose in places where it shouldn't be. He seems to get in a lot of carnage with other drivers. This is not unique to this season. We saw it last season in a couple instances. The most notable one was Sergio Perez and kind of the backlash that drew between a Racing Bull and a Red Bull Racing team collision. Not what you want to see out of a rookie driver, obviously. But I think in this case, Lawson was actually in the right here, and Albon was complaining quite a bit over the radio of this, but it must have just been heat of the moment because I can't imagine that he would go back and watch that onboard and think that Lawson was at fault. That was definitely an Albon mistake, and at the end of the day, Albon was the one that had to pay for it, and Lawson didn't. So I think it all worked out, fortunately / unfortunately, but it is what it is. Now, moving into one where I said Lawson puts his nose in places where it shouldn't be, and typically these things seem to be more his fault than the other driver's fault. The next one, I think, is an instance of Lawson putting his nose literally where it shouldn't have been. just coming with an absolute send, which I respect, by the way, but an absolute send down the inside on Behrman. That was super deep. I don't think Behrman had any expectation for Lawson to be there on the apex at that time, and they came together, collided. Once again, Lawson kind of narrowly avoiding something that could have been a lot worse than it was. You know, they had contact, no one really seemed to get damaged, and so everything was all good there, but definitely could have been worse. And then the next lap, Lawson has the ability to do the same move and is in a spot that seems like is a lot more feasible to make a dive down the outside or down the inside type move. And then you could tell he was scared from the lap before because he pulled out of the inside move, then tried to go to the outside, but just didn't have that move in there. And so ended up getting delayed for a couple more corners before finally making the pass on Behrman, where he clearly had more pace. Over into an interesting radio message, actually a little funny exchange between Verstappen and GP. So if you all remember last week's / to be honest, most of this season, Verstappen has been complaining a lot about both the brakes and the upshifts on his car. You hear him complain about the upshifts on his car basically every weekend. Last week at Monaco, he made a reference of it felt like he was driving an F1 car from 1973. And so when Verstappen complained about the upshifts again, GP gave him a little cheeky, feels like you're driving a car from 1973 again. And Verstappen came back, he's like, maybe 74 this time. So that was a little funny in race exchange. Last week, it seemed a little bit almost heated when Verstappen said that, but you could tell over the radio this week that it was he took it as being funny, and I thought it was good entertainment for the race. But it is very interesting to see that Verstappen seems to consistently have this issue with upshifts a lot, and then also his brakes through every GP, and they can't really seem to figure out how to solve that issue. Now moving back into Ferrari a little bit later in the race with another very interesting strategy decision. So this kind of brings the undercut defense full circle and makes everything a lot more confusing to me personally. So in the first stint with Hamilton, they pit him early. He goes, "Why are we pitting so early? That's a long time on this tire." They say to cover the undercut. They later switched that to probably cover the undercut because Mercedes had no intention, it appears, of undercutting them. But then in the second stint, they then allowed Mercedes to undercut them. So I found that super confusing. It's shortly after the race, so I'm not sure if there's been any team announcements or radio messages or anything that came out that can kind of explain that better. But I found that super interesting that they veered from their strategy to cover an undercut that wasn't happening just to allow Mercedes to undercut them in the second stint. Didn't really make a lot of sense to me. Seemed like, once again, Ferrari doing typical Ferrari things, which is unfortunate to see. I hope this is not a glimpse into what we will see through the rest of the season. I hope this was just a one race episode of this, and that we will move on and not see these kind of confusing things out of the Ferrari pit wall moving forward. But this is where the race starts to get very interesting. So Antonelli ends up retiring into the gravel with a power unit issue, bringing out a full safety car with about, I think it was like 7 or 8 laps left in the GP. This is where it paid out big time for Leclerc yesterday for not doing that second stint, saving an extra set of softs. This is unfortunately for Verstappen, where the 3 pit stop strategy did not pan out at all, because the 3 stop maybe could have stayed at 3 stop. He talked about this a little about the race. You know, hindsight, maybe he should have kept track position, stayed on those mediums, but they ultimately decided to pit for a fresh set, but they only had hards as their fresh set, a set of tires that no one ran on the weekend during the GP, at least. They ran them during practice. And so he was on a fresh set of hards, but everyone knew that that tire was not a good tire for the GP, where other people were able to pit for mediums and softs. And so Verstappen was understandably upset over the team radio. I don't really know what the team was supposed to do there, though. They just didn't have another set of tires. That was their only option. And so you could see him really trying to generate a lot of heat into the tires while behind the safety car, constantly weaving. All the drivers do that, but he was doing it a lot more because he knew that he was going to be just massively on the back foot on the restart. Unfortunately, too, with the safety car, I don't know what's going on with safety cars this year, but they're leaving them out seemingly way too long. Imola was a really bad instance of this. I think it happened again here. The safety car was out at least 1 lap too long, maybe 2 laps too long, but they were able to clear Antonelli's car off the track fairly quickly because he pulled off in a pretty good spot. I felt like they waited a little bit longer than they needed to allow the cars to unlap. And then when they did allow the cars to unlap, instead of restarting the race on the next lap, they waited essentially until the lapped cars caught all the way up to the back, which took 2 laps to restart the race. With that, though, Piastri got a blinding fast safety car restart. I was wondering how this was going to go. I was wondering if this was going to be a little bit like Miami sprint again. Now, obviously not exactly the same scenario because there was a tire mismatch between Lando and Piastri in that instance. There wasn't a tire mismatch here, but it was an instance of Piastri had essentially dominated the whole weekend, dominated the GP, and then, had a lead, and just for a safety car to come out and bring Norris back into contention, potentially for a race win. Piastri, though, did not let that happen. He had a super quick safety car restart, pulling out by the end of the race over the 6 laps, 5 or 6 laps that there was left. He had pulled out like a 2.5 second gap, 2.5 to 3 second gap over Norris. And so he showed that he had considerable pace over Norris at the end. So it was good to see Piastri be able to kind of hold on to the victory and not be affected by that safety car. On the flip side, though, Verstappen was massively affected by that safety car. You saw when he came out of the last corner into the straightaway passing the start-finish line, he lost the rear end of that Red Bull racing car, giving Leclerc, who, to be honest, was going to have a chance on a run on him regardless, being on those fresh softs versus those hards, but that really allowed it to close a lot quicker. Then Verstappen, tried to box out Leclerc or push him more towards the middle of the track onto the rolled up rubber, try to get him onto the dirty section of the track, maybe give a shot going into turn 1. I do find it interesting because Verstappen was over the radio a little bit later saying Leclerc ran into him, but then that's where Verstappen got a little bit hung out trying to fight with Leclerc going into turn 1. Russell was also on some newer tires, was able to come up the inside of Verstappen, and they did have contact, forcing Verstappen off the track. Verstappen left the track and then re-entered the track ahead of Russell, potentially causing what could have been penalty for leaving the track to gain an advantage. It actually came out later that the steward said that when they reviewed that specific event, they did not have an intention of awarding a penalty to Verstappen for doing that. They were going to allow him to keep the position. However, Red Bull apparently was worried about it and asked Verstappen to give the position back to Russell, which I do understand because I think it was Verstappen. I can't recall. It was someone, but I think it was Verstappen where something similar to this happened in a sprint race or a race where he ended up getting the penalty and it was right after a safety car. And so 5-second, 10-second penalties after a safety car are a lot more impactful, obviously, because the field is bunched up. And instead of losing, 1 position, maybe even 0 positions in some cases, you end up losing a whole ton of positions, pushing you back pretty far on the grid. And so I think that's what they were trying to avoid. Unfortunately, that did not pan out because Verstappen, taking a page out of like a stock car driver, NASCAR driver's book, ends up looking like he's going to give the position back to Russell and then speeding up and just ramming into the side of him, which I don't know the last time I've seen something like that happen in Formula One where it was so clearly intentional. I was actually thinking that the penalty that they were going to give was going to be a lot worse than a 10-second penalty. I could have seen, yeah, like a disqualification, a race suspension. I don't know. Like I'm glad, to be honest. Like I'm glad that they didn't do a race suspension. I'm glad that they didn't do a dequalification. But I could see it in that instance because that was very intentional. And Formula One doesn't seem to tolerate things like that in the same way that maybe some other racing series do. And so I thought that that was going to be a lot more than a 10-second penalty, transparently. In that instance, though, a 10-second penalty was very impactful, dropping him from 5th position all the way back to 10th position. He did end up getting 3 points on his super license, though, which puts him 1 point away from a race suspension. So if he gets in another incident between now and the end of June, which there's 2 GPs that fall in that time frame, he will get a race suspension, which has only happened once with Kevin Magnussen, who just seemed like he was on an absolute carnage career journey last year, just playing the team games and oftentimes, ending up wadding up other drivers in the process. But definitely one of the crazier moments that I've seen in Formula One in a while, to see Verstappen very intentionally hit the side of Russell. Now, luckily, it didn't affect Russell's race. No one got hurt. No one got knocked out of the race. It would have been unfortunate if that did happen, but it didn't. Verstappen did hurt himself, though, with that 10-second penalty after a safety car, which dropped him a significant amount of positions. And then moving back over into another interesting moment on the safety car restart, we had Hamilton v. Hülkenberg. So a Kick Sauber fighting a Ferrari. I did not have that in my cards for this race. I don't think anybody did. I don't think anybody would have saw that all season. Hülkenberg on an absolute flying race. I have to imagine that Hamilton went on a used set of softs, which would make sense because he did more races during qualifying. He didn't save a set of softs, but the lack of pace that he had there, the only thing that makes sense is he was on used softs for Hülkenberg to be able to overtake a Ferrari in a Kick Sauber, and especially against a driver like Hamilton. Yeah, maybe he hasn't been on the form that he's had in the past. Maybe Leclerc has significantly outperformed him, but he's not some no-name driver. He's a 7-time world championship. So to see something like that is insane. And to be honest, seeing Verstappen win driver of the day, I found that super interesting because I feel like Verstappen's had a lot of really good drives. And because it's Verstappen, he oftentimes does not win driver of the day. I felt like this race, to be honest, was like, even before the penalty and everything, I felt like it was it was a good drive, but it wasn't like the best drive out of Verstappen ever. And he was at best on track for a 3rd place finish. So I was very interested to see that he got nominated, and then especially in the instance of a Kick Sauber, Nico Hülkenberg all the way up into P5 or P6, but after the penalty from Verstappen, P5, like how he didn't win driver of the day, that was absolutely stolen out from underneath of Hülkenberg, in my opinion. But it is what it is there. And then Alonso was also able to pass Lawson because of the safety car, putting him into P10, securing the points. Once again, with Verstappen's penalty, that moved Alonso up to P9 for some even more points. But this was good. It was good to see Alonso finally get some points on the board. He's been extremely unlucky this season. It is funny, though, that I feel like one of Alonso's not greatest drives, when you take it all together, especially with him kind of driving it off the track, which is not something that you see much. And then this be the race that he gets in the points is, I don't know, just a very interesting storyline to add on to the storyline that Alonso has had all season. But overall, the Spanish GP was an absolutely chaotic race. Like I said, I think the best race of the season. Definitely made up for the lackluster Monaco, which was great to see. I hope we get more races like this, especially because, like we said, this 3 race stretch is typically seen as one of the harder circuits to pass on. That held in Monaco, that did not hold in Imola, that did not hold in the Spanish GP. I hope this is maybe some foreshadowing for the rest of the European tracks that come this season that we are going to continue to get action-packed racing and a lot of overtakes, but only time will tell there. If you enjoyed the episode, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe. I will be releasing multiple videos a week, and I would love to see you here, and I will see you all later.